While Ukraine awaits Donald Trump's first decisions following his inauguration on January 20th, the likely new U.S. Secretary of State has shared his views on the future of the war in front of the U.S. Senate. Washington's next top diplomat is convinced both Kyiv and Moscow need to make concessions in order to reach a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Kyiv is the stage of an intense diplomatic offensive, with the British Prime Minister being just the latest Western leader to pledge more help for Ukraine over the last few days. To discuss these issues, we're joined by Iulia Osmolovska, Director of GLOBSEC Kyiv, and Bohdan Nahaylo, Editor-in-Chief of the Kyiv Post. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So, Marco Rubio says both Russia and Ukraine need to be realistic and make concessions. So, what concessions is Kyiv ready for, given the fact that President Zelensky has repeatedly stated that Ukraine would not cede any territories? Iulia Osmolovska, please.
I would start actually from not answering the question what concessions, but rather explaining why we hear these statements right now. My assessment is that we at least hear initial assessment of the situation as it is for now from the officials, nominated officials by the Trump people. So apparently this is a strategy and the view they're going to pursue. But again, they are not all alone in this. They need to interact with both sides and to see whether both sides are really willing to negotiate and what they're ready to do as a concessions. My highest doubt is that Russia has this will to negotiate, because apparently they think that they have the upper hand right now in the situation, and definitely they're not going to withdraw from the initial demands. So I think that it's going to be a very, very long journey, and along this journey, the Americans might reassess their position. As you've seen from the initial statements of Trump, I'll finish the war in 24 hours. It's already extended to 6 months and probably even longer. So I wouldn't be sticking to what they say right now, but to interpret this as their starting position in the game.
But on the Nahaylo now, at this particular moment, let me repeat this question. Is Ukraine ready to cede any of its territory? And again, what are those Russian proposals, which Iulia Osmolovska already mentioned? Because Bloomberg writes about Ukraine losing all Russian-occupied territories and becoming a neutral state with no perspectives to join NATO whatsoever.
Well, of course, the official position is that it's not, but we're in a process right now of seeing where things will end up. The Americans too are suggesting that this is the time for negotiation, and or rather beginning negotiation by beginning to see what both sides are prepared to settle for. The Ukrainian side has said very clearly that it is not there to give up territory after such a bloody war of 3 years and such losses, and that it wants security guarantees, which means NATO membership, EU membership, etc. But I'm a little bit more reassured by the latest statements coming out from Washington, because they're not as hardline as they were a month or 2 or 3 ago. Even the Americans, the new American foreign minister, let's call him that, Secretary of State, in his statement yesterday is saying that, you know, very clearly that Russia is in the wrong. Russia needs to be put in its place, but obviously we can't go for a zero-sum type of approach, that some kind of compromise will have to be worked out. And the message from Washington, even from Hegseth, who's going to take over the Pentagon, is saying that any compromise that's reached has to be as advantageous as possible for the Ukrainians. What this amounts to, we don't know. I mean, it's all words at the moment, and we're not sure what's going on behind the scenes.
Now, Kyiv has been hosting foreign officials for the last few days, just after German defense minister's visit. Today, we had the visit of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to Kyiv. Now, the question is, can Europe realistically fill the gap if the US decides to cut off any substantial military help to Ukraine? Iulia Osmolovska, please.
Yes, there are different assessments of that, whether Europe can 100% replace the American assistance, and none of them I've seen that's a definite yes. And the most important in this is that European capitals acknowledging this, recognizing this, and at the moment they're in very active phase to see what they can do to upgrade their capacities. Also, as far as I heard, they're considering the possibility of buying American military equipment for Ukraine. So at the moment, it's very difficult to say what is the definite position, but actually it's the process in the right direction.
Right. Now, Bohdan Nahaylo, do you think that these visits are aimed to put some pressure on the new administration in Washington to let Donald Trump know that the relation of Europe and Ukraine is ironclad, and therefore force him not to abandon Kyiv? Do you think that's the goal of this diplomatic offensive in the last few days?
Well, it's not a diplomatic offensive of the last few days, let's be honest. It's a diplomatic offensive of several months, knowing that Trump was likely to win or had a good chance. And then since he's won, thinking about the implications of that. And let's remember that President Zelensky was in Warsaw yesterday. So it's not just, high-ranking officials coming to Kyiv. Europe has got to get its act together. And there has to be a plan B if the worst comes to the worst and Trump goes for an isolationist policy and is more preoccupied, let's say, with Greenland or comments that he's been making about Canada even, then obviously Europe will have to be realistic and fend more for itself. And I think with Poland at the helm of the EU, with Macron and Britain online, with several of the Scandinavian states and the others, Finland also, I think, the Americans are also feeling the pressure, the new administration, that they can't simply abandon Europe and they can't abandon Ukraine. And I would say that we're seeing a subtle change in tone from the new administration to be coming from Washington. It's much more guarded than it was, more gung-ho a month ago.
Mm-hmm. Iulia Osmolovska, now, how would you comment on Russian drones attacking Kyiv during Keir Starmer's visit? It's nothing new. That's something that foreign officials are now used to, I guess.
Yes, of course, and Kyiv probably is one of the most protected cities or places in Ukraine right now. So yes, it's definitely discomfort, but it's also like a sign of reminding our Western partners that they shouldn't give up and they shouldn't abandon Ukraine for this. And if you can trace different developments on different stages in war, the more resolute support from the Western partners has been coming actually after the most cruel attacks on Ukraine. Just I recall the boldest statement of the G7 under German presidency last year, I guess, not in 2023, when actually the strongest support for protection of Ukraine's critical infrastructure had been delivered. So I think that it's only in a sad way, but it only helps us to maintain this support in a way.
Right, Bohdan Nahaylo now. So what are Kyiv and Moscow discussing in Qatar, and can these negotiations bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. Let's not call them negotiations. They have nothing much to discuss at this stage. It's a zero-sum game. Ukraine doesn't want to give up territory and its sovereignty and its right to belong in the European family of nations. So it's a non-starter at the moment with Ukraine, and it's certainly not willing to discuss giving up 20% of its territory. For what? And also, let's remember, who is to pay the costs of this horrendous war? Is the EU, is America prepared to do it if we let Russia off the hook? Russia needs to, be found as the guilty party and to pay for this. It's doing it partly by being forced to, give up its assets in the West, and already that money is coming to Europe. That's one thing, but there's also the question of war crimes. Putin is a war criminal. We've had horrendous war crimes committed, perhaps not seen since former Yugoslavia, but certainly World War II. And we're going to say what? Well, let's forget about this. Let's have a compromise. Let's have a ceasefire and pretend nothing happened. Business as usual. That's not on. And for Russia, I mean, look at what they're telling their domestic public. Read their papers. They're saying, even in the last day or two, the BBC correspondent noted today that the papers are saying there is a chance that we will restore the USSR by the end of this year. And, it's likely that Ukraine won't even exist as a state by this summer. They're feeding their own people this hype, whereas they're pretending that they're willing to negotiate at some level with the West. But also remember that key officials in Russia are saying we don't want Ukraine to be involved in these discussions. This is a deal between Russia and America. Keep others out. What are we talking about? Return to Cold War rhetoric and Kissinger type mentality that only the big states matter. So this is not good for Poland. This is not good for the Czech Republic, for Britain, for anybody else. I mean, we have to take into account what the Russians are actually doing and saying, but the pretense that they have for the outside world as if they're reasonable partners and they're realpolitik-minded and you can somehow come to terms with them.
Iulia Osmolovska, director of GLOBSEC Kyiv, and Bohdan Nahaylo, editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Post, were our guests this evening. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching. Adam Jasers on the record with Polish Deputy Foreign Minister Władysław Teofil Bartoszewski is coming up next.